like to do a couple of things in this lecture. First, to just revisit again the notion of why communication should be viewed strategically rather than just a bunch of activities that we do just because we do them. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at a step-by-step communication planning methodology. This is put together by the Communication Executive Council. There are other methodologies. This is the methodology, the CEC methodology, that I'll be walking through that I think is just very solid, very straightforward, has all the elements clearly outlined. And so I'm going to walk through those and really hopefully allow you to kind of think through the process as well as we go along. Now, in terms of strategic communication, as Argenti states, the best, most effective kind of communication is aligned with the company's overall strategy to enhance its strategic positioning. That's really what ultimately we'll want to do on a big scale within an organization. If we're talking about a communication function, how can we have the impact we need to have to achieve some of the things I talked about in week one, to really sort of drive some of the factors, whether we're looking at internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, that will really enhance organizational performance. And Argenti talks about, well, what do you need in order to make this kind of strategic communication happen? And obviously you need the involvement of senior managers. You need your communication activities to be integrated. You need a long-term orientation, because strategy, by definition, even in a rapidly changing marketplace and environment, asks you to think longer term. And speaking the language of business, I'm a big believer in this. I think that to communicate with people in different functions at different levels in the organization, you have to begin to think about what language do they speak. And when you think about CEOs and heads of marketing, sales, finance, operations, they're talking the language of business, whether you're in a nonprofit or in a profit-making organization. And you're going to be more persuasive if you learn that language. Now, what's interesting, I also posted an article about some findings that the Project Management Institute came up with based on a survey that showed that high performers create formal communication plans for nearly twice as many projects as low performers. So even at a project level, if you have a plan that supports that project, you're going to be a communication plan, you're going to be more effective in achieving the results you want to achieve with that project. Now, here are the steps in the thought process, and I'm going to go into more detail as we go through this thought process. And you'll notice this headline, Outcome-Focused Communication Planning. This is planning. This isn't just intended to be sort of a paper document that you fill out and then forget about. This is really intended to identify what outcomes are you trying to achieve and how do you connect sort of your big objectives with an implementation plan. So the steps are: establish your communication objective, understand your audience, its motivations. Talked a lot about this in week one, didn't we? What are your audiences thinking and feeling? Create an action plan that includes success measures and what channels you're going to use, and then track and report progress. And obviously, if you're not tracking, monitoring what's going on with your plan, if it's a 2-month plan, a 12-month plan, you're not really going to know what's going on with that plan and how effective you're being. So you need that tracking and reporting piece. Now here is what CEC argues is this is a plan. These are the components of a plan. This is where you want to end up. So you've got a business objective, a target audience, a communication objective. You've got a communication activity, and that lower set, that row at the bottom there, that's the implementation piece. So you've got the activity, you've got the channel, media that you're using to achieve the objective. You've identified who's responsible and target dates, and then you've defined what are some measures of success. And because this is we're dealing with hypothetical, we're not going to really focus too much on owners and timelines, but I think based on the principle of commitment, that you need owners and timelines. You need a sense of who's going to take this on and what target dates are we looking at to complete certain steps. So let's take a deeper dive into the first 3 steps in the planning process. I'm going to look at each one of these. Step 1, what business objective are you supporting with this communication activity? This is so important, and it goes to our role as communicators. How do we become strategic consultants with our business partners? And when I say business partners, I mean somebody in marketing comes to you and says, we need communication activities to support this marketing initiative. Okay, let's sit down and think through what are your objectives in terms of marketing, and how can communication support those objectives? That's a discussion that I remember sometimes not having. I was just simply told when I was managing a communication function, generate some communication support for this. But I didn't have a chance to engage in a dialogue about what would really work best. This is like somebody telling you, let's set up a corporate Facebook page, without having an understanding of what is the business objective that gets close, that we're really trying to work toward and support. So that's step number 1. Step 2, stakeholder audience analysis. And here, we're getting away from the notion that, okay, our audience is very simply kind of, in this graphic it's called one-way hierarchical, but one-way communication. We're in a world now where communication is networked, where our audience is being influenced by not only perhaps our messaging, but what the audience lives in a social network itself. And so it's being influenced by opinion leaders, by influencers, formal and informal, and we have to take into account those influencers. Stakeholder analysis matrix, a key part of your communication plan to complete that kind of stakeholder analysis, and keep in mind not simply the target audience, but also those other often very informal influencers that you also need to try to influence with your communication. Then we have our communication objective. Now, I always argue, thinking about your stakeholders, audiences, and your communication objectives, you've got to do those in tandem. If you don't know your audience, how can you come up with a communication objective? If you haven't really thought through your stakeholders, what they're thinking, feeling, how can you come up with a good communication objective? I really like the way CEC lays this out. So they've got kind of categories of objectives. Know, think, feel, do, share. And then the purpose that goes along with that. So let's say know, the purpose, create awareness around a particular initiative. The example, inform employees about company financial results. I think that's a really good, straightforward way to think about communication objectives. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to influence, persuade our audiences to learn something, to change their attitudes about something, to do something. to change, to motivate some kind of behavior. I like these categories of know, think, feel, do, and share. You're going to be coming across some of these notions later on. For example, those of you in the organizational communication program, we have a course, CMN 6100, that deals with communications and communication networks and media and messaging, strategic messaging, and you'll come across this notion of know, think, feel, and do. Same thing in our capstone measurement and assessment course. These are our objectives. This is what we try to achieve, and measurement helps us determine to what extent we've achieved those objectives. So I'd like you to really spend some time thinking about these objectives and other examples that you can think of that fit into the categories of objectives we have here. So we've done the big picture steps, in a sense. What business objective, then our stakeholder analysis, then our communication objectives, and then we have to think about, for each communication objective, how do we achieve that? So here we're getting tactical. What communication activity should we undertake? What channels are we going to use and media are we going to use to deliver those messages? And then think about, what's success? How do we define success? This gets you to the outcome, right? When you're thinking about indicators of success, that tells you, how do we know it's working or not working and having the impact we want it to have? If we do all of those steps, we end up with our communication plan. And you can format it in all kinds of ways. You could build out a table like this. You could have a kind of outline form. You could have narrative pieces in here. The key is to have all the pieces and show their relationships to each other. I like these tactical pieces that CEC provides. For example, when we're looking at the communication channel that we're going to use, or the channels we're going to use, you look here on the left, the channel type. Then they give you examples, what they're good for, role of communication, and every channel, every medium has a pro and a con. So again, when you're thinking about building out your plan at the implementation level, these are some of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about. That's our job as communicators in any communication-related role. And then, how do we define success? Again, we've got a bunch of metrics that we can think about, or measures that we can think about, but I really like those communication metrics. So the behavioral ones are, how does our audience, how do our stakeholders respond to our communication activity? The attitudinal ones, how do they respond in terms of their perceptions, their motivations, their willingness to do something? And of course, they're always, that volume transactional metric column, readership, followers, sentiment, number of posts, attendance. In a way, I view that as behavioral as well, because those are actions that our stakeholders, our audiences are taking as a result of our communication activity. Now you have a planning methodology that you can adapt. Now, many organizations have their own planning methodologies. For many years at my insurance company, we had a strategic planning, business planning methodology that I was involved with. And of course you have to adapt, but this is a communication planning methodology. And I'd encourage you to see how you can apply it. So to recap, what does a plan do? It links purpose to concrete action. It can be large scale, it can be small scale. And this is the point I guess I really want to emphasize. Planning is a systematic thought process. Instead of being reactive or looking at things in small chunks without thinking about how they all hang together, planning forces us to be proactive, strategic, think about the linkage between purpose and action. I think this thought process is going to come in as a very valuable basis for you to think about all sorts of types of communication plans. Yes, they may differ to somewhat in format, but the thought process I think is pretty universal.